Late in the quiet, after a day of chewing gritty food, something goes wrong inside. A single tooth, a faint ache, a pressure that wasn't there the day before, easy to ignore for now. Today that costs almost nothing. A brush, a dentist, a tablet for the pain. For nearly the whole of human history, none of that waited on the other side of that first ache. The body faced what came next alone. So what did a body do? Across almost all the time humans have lived, when a tooth began to fail, and nothing could stop it. There is a particular kind of evening that is repeated across almost the whole span of time humans have lived. An evening so ordinary that it left no mark on any record we can read now. The last of the daylight is draining out of the sky, going from gold to grey to the deep colourless blue that comes just before true dark, and the warmth that pressed against the skin through the middle of the day is loosening its hold, the open ground giving up its heat by slow degrees once the sun has dropped below the edge of the world. Close by, a small fire works through the thinner branches with a dry, uneven crackle, throwing a circle of moving light, and past the reach of that light, the land eases into its night sounds, insects lifting out of the grass, a thin wind moving through whatever leaves are near, the low shifting of a group settling toward rest after a long day of walking and gathering and chewing through coarse food. A body sits in that firelight, tired in the plainest way a body can be tired, and inside the quiet of its own mouth something has begun to change, though nothing in the evening gives any sign of it yet. To understand what is changing, it helps to look first at what a mouth was, in a world with no brush, no paste, no thread, no small mirror held up to catch the light, no one whose work it was to look inside and mend what they found. Such a mouth, measured against the standards a modern person carries, would look startling. The teeth in it were worn, worn heavily, worn in a way that has grown rare now. By the time a person reached what we would call full adulthood, the sharp points that a young child's molars carry, the ridged crowns built for tearing and grinding, had often been smoothed down toward flat, ground away over years of use until the harder outer shell gave way in places to the softer material beneath, showing as small darker islands on the flattened surface of a back tooth. The gums, too, tended to pull back over the years, drawing away from the base of each tooth and leaving the softer surface near the root exposed to the open mouth, a place where trouble could begin more easily than on the hard crown above. The strange part, and the part the evidence keeps pointing toward, is that these heavily worn mouths held comparatively few of the deep holes we now fear most. The cavity, the dark pit eating inward, appears to have been less common in the era before settled farming than it became in the ages after. The enemy of the mouth in this older world was less rot than sheer wear, and the reason for that wear sat in nearly every mouthful of food a person took. A root pulled from the ground came up with soil still clinging to it, fine grit that no rinsing in a cold stream could fully carry away. Seeds and hard grains crushed between two stones picked up powder from the stone itself, and that powder went into the meal and then over the teeth. Many plants carry within their own tissue microscopic bodies of silica, called phytoliths by the researchers who study them, hard enough to scratch enamel a little, with each grinding pass of the jaw. Wind-blown sand settled onto drying meat, and gritty ash from the cooking fire clung to whatever was roasted in the coals. All of it passed across the teeth, thousands of small abrasive movements in a single day, tens of millions across a lifetime, and the teeth wore down under it the way a stone step wears under many generations of feet. This matters because of one quiet, unforgiving fact about the material itself. Enamel, the pale hard shell on the outside of every tooth, is the hardest substance the human body builds, almost entirely mineral, harder than most bone. Yet once a tooth has finished forming in the jaw of a child, that enamel holds no living cells of its own. Skin torn open closes over within days. Bone cracked clean across will knit back together over weeks, laying down fresh material along the break until the seam grows strong again. Enamel does none of this. Whatever is ground away, whatever cracks or thins or breaks, stays gone. The body has no way to build it back. A mouth in this old world, Then was a set of tools that could only be spent, worn steadily down across a lifetime with nothing to renew them, and a person carried the running total of every meal they had ever eaten in the very shape of their teeth. Because there was nothing made to clean those teeth, their surfaces carried a living film, a soft layer of bacteria that fed on the traces of each meal and thickened, day over day, into a hard crust the researchers call dental calculus, tartar in the plainer word. That crust is no small thing to the people who study the deep past. It mineralizes and holds, and archaeologists now carefully scrape it from teeth that have lain in the ground for many thousands of years, because sealed inside it are the dust of ancient meals, grains of starch, threads of plant fiber, even fragments of the very microbes that lived in that mouth, while it still drew breath, a whole life of eating, fossilized against the side of a tooth, the same crust pressed against the gums and helped push them further back. So the wearing of the crown and the pulling back of the gum worked on the mouth together, two slow processes running side by side through the years. Into a mouth like this, worn and filmed and entirely unremarkable, on an evening like any other, comes the new thing. A single tooth, perhaps one of the lower molars that has taken the heaviest grinding over the years, sends up a thin thread of ache. It is not sharp. It is a pressure more than a pain, a dull point of awareness where a moment before there was nothing at all to notice, the sort of small wrong feeling a person explores with the tip of the tongue, pressing at it, testing the edge of it, then deciding is probably nothing worth any worry. To understand why that thread of ache has surfaced now, on this night rather than another, it helps to look just beneath the enamel. Under that hard outer shell lies a softer layer called dentin, and dentin is not solid all the way through. It is threaded with many thousands of microscopic tubes, far too small for any eye to see, each one running inward from the surface toward the living heart of the tooth, where the nerve and its blood supply sit in a sheltered hollow. So long as the enamel above stays whole and thick, that inner layer remains sealed away, silent, feeling nothing of the outside world. Where a lifetime of grit has worn the enamel thin, though, or where a fine crack has opened under the pressure of biting down on something harder than expected, or where the film of bacteria has begun eating its slow way down through the surface, the dentin beneath meets the open mouth for the first time, and those countless tiny tubes do their work with quiet efficiency, carrying the touch of cold water or of simple pressure straight inward to the nerve. The first twinge is the small sound of a door that has stood closed for a lifetime beginning to swing open. What that first ache asks of a person now is close to nothing. A brush morning and evening, a careful rinse, and if the feeling lingers past a few days, a short visit to someone with a bright light and a fine metal point who can find the thinning spot and seal it over before it has any chance to deepen. The whole matter is caught in its earliest hour and closed away, and most people have forgotten it happened by the following week. That path did not lie open on this evening. On the far side of the ache, in the world this account is walking slowly through, there was no bright light, no fine metal point, no sealing over. There was only the ache itself, and the body it belonged to, and the long stretch of time ahead. This was not a rare misfortune singling one person out. It was a threshold that countless mouths crossed, a first evening that arrived, sooner or later, for almost everyone who lived long enough. The fire has burned lower now, sunk toward a bed of orange coals that pulse and dim with each pass of the wind, and the cold has settled further into the ground, seeping up through whatever the body is resting on. Packed earth, a laid-out hide, a heap of dry grass gathered against the chill. The ache is still small. It remains small enough to set down, small enough to lose beneath the heavier, simpler tiredness of a day spent moving across the land, and so the eyes close, and sleep arrives the way it arrives, to the very tired, all at once, and without ceremony. The tooth, which cannot heal itself, which holds no path back to what it was that same morning, waits quietly through the dark hours while the body rests. When the grey light returns and the air begins, slowly, to warm again, the ache will still be there. It will be there the morning after that one, and the morning after that. And the days ahead, one following the next, will begin without any hurry to answer a question the body cannot yet even think to ask. Morning arrives the way it always does, grey light seeping in first, and then a slow return of warmth, birds working through the low branches, the coals from the night before still holding enough heat under their skin of ash to be woken with a handful of dry grass. The body wakes stiff from the ground, and before it has done anything else at all, the tongue goes to the tooth. It goes there without being sent. Overnight the ache has not grown, but it has not left either, and that alone marks it as something new, because most small hurts a body collects in a day of moving across rough country are gone by the next morning, and this one has stayed. There is a mechanism working inside the tooth at this moment, and it is the one genuine defense the tooth has, though it is easy to mistake for healing when it is closer to a retreat. Deep in the sheltered hollow, at the center of the tooth, where the nerve and its small supply of blood sit together, there are living cells whose whole task is to make the softer inner material. When the outer layers thin and the countless microscopic tubes of the dentin begin carrying the outside world inward, those cells respond by laying down fresh material along the inner wall, a new layer built on the side facing the nerve. Over weeks and months, the wall thickens there, the tubes narrow and clog, and the sensation carried inward grows a little duller. This is the only repair the tooth can make, and it happens entirely on the inside, adding nothing back to the worn surface where the trouble actually began. The tooth cannot rebuild its shell. It can only wall itself in, retreating inward a fraction at a time while the outside continues to be ground away, and the outcome of that race depends on which side moves faster. When wear comes on gently across many years, the inner wall often keeps pace, and a tooth may grind down to a flat, polished stump without ever waking a serious pain, which is one reason so many heavily worn ancient teeth show no sign of having caused their owner much distress. When the surface gives way faster than the wall can thicken, the tooth loses the race, and the loser is announced by exactly the kind of ache that arrived last night. Nothing about this is visible from outside, and nothing about it can be felt as it happens. What can be felt, over the next several days, is that the ache begins to acquire a shape. It has a preference for certain moments. Water carried in a skin or a hollow gourd from a stream running cold off higher ground draws a bright thin line of feeling straight up into the jaw when it washes over that side of the mouth. Biting down on a strip of dried meat, the kind that needs long work from the back teeth before it will yield, presses on the tooth in a way that makes the body pause mid-chew and wait for the feeling to pass before continuing. The first bright morning air drawn in through an open mouth carries its own small sting. Each of these is brief, and each of them fades within a breath or two, and together they begin teaching the body a set of rules it has not chosen to learn. There is a great difference between a hurt that arrives once and a hurt that has learned when to arrive, because the second one starts to shape the ordinary movements of a day, and this one has begun to do that within a week of its first appearance. What happens next is the part of this story that the ground has actually preserved, and it is more specific than one might expect. The teeth of people who lived long before any written record carry small marks that researchers have studied closely and interpreted carefully. Along the sides of certain back teeth, at the level where two neighboring teeth meet and the gum sits between them, some ancient teeth show narrow grooves, worn horizontally into the surface, smooth and rounded in cross-section. These grooves appear on teeth from a striking range of times and places, on specimens attributed to Neanderthals, and to still older members of the human family, and they have been found often enough that they are not treated as accidents of preservation. The interpretation most researchers favour is that something was worked repeatedly into that space between the teeth, over and over, across a long stretch of a person's life, until the object itself wore a channel into the enamel. A stiff grass stem, a splinter of bone, a thin sliver of wood. Any of these, used habitually, could leave such a mark. The reasoning has to stay careful, since a groove in a fossil tooth cannot say out loud what made it or why, and the researchers who publish these findings tend to hedge accordingly. What the grooves do establish, at minimum, is that human beings were putting objects into their mouths and working at their teeth with them, deliberately and repeatedly, an extraordinarily long time before anyone made anything that would be recognized now as a tool for the purpose. Some of these grooves appear on teeth in jaws that also show clear signs of gum disease, worn bone around the roots, and other traces of long inflammation, which has led some researchers to suggest the working at the tooth may have been a response to discomfort, rather than only a matter of clearing away food. So the picture that emerges is of hands reaching toward the problem. Not with anything that could reach where the problem actually lived, but reaching all the same. A frayed twig, chewed at one end until the fibers separate into a rough brush, does genuinely clear the softer film from a tooth's surface, and some of the plants used in various regions carry compounds that slow the growth of bacteria to a modest degree. Bitter bark held against a sore gum, aromatic leaves crushed and chewed, a mouthful of water swirled and spat, the mineral crust scraped at with a fingernail or a bone point. These are real actions with real, if limited, effects, and they have been documented in enough recent traditional contexts around the world that assuming something broadly similar in the deeper past is reasonable. Though the specific details cannot be recovered, there is even a direct trace of substances kept in the mouth for long periods. Pieces of birch bark pitch, a dark tar produced by heating bark, have been recovered from northern European sites bearing the impressions of human teeth, chewed thousands of years ago and then dropped or discarded, some of them preserving enough biological material for researchers to read the microbes that were living in that mouth at the time. Whatever the reasons for chewing it, and those reasons remain a matter of discussion, the pitch is physical proof of a substance worked deliberately and at length between the teeth. Every one of these efforts shares the same limitation, and the limitation is a matter of simple geography inside a tooth. All of them act on the surface. The trouble in this particular tooth is now beneath the surface, running down through the microscopic tubes toward the nerve, or spreading sideways in the softer layer under a shell of enamel that still looks perfectly intact from above. A twig cannot reach it. Water cannot rinse it. Nothing chewed, held, or scraped can travel into a place the body has sealed with the hardest material it knows how to build. And there is a further difficulty that sits underneath all of this, which is that the body offers no way to know what is happening. The ache reports that something is wrong. It does not report where, or how deep, or how fast, or whether the effort being made against it is helping at all. A person doing everything within reach and a person doing nothing whatsoever would feel roughly the same thing over these days, and neither would be able to tell which of them was right. Today that gap is closed with a beam of light, a small angled mirror, and an image made through the jaw showing the exact shape of the hollow inside, so that a decision can be made from knowledge rather than from guessing. In this older world, the inside of a tooth was as far out of reach as the far side of the moon, and every choice made about it was made blind. The days pass in their ordinary sequence, warm middays and cooling evenings, the fire built up and burning down, food gathered and shared and chewed. The tongue keeps returning to the tooth, dozens of times between waking and dark, checking it the way one checks a loose stone underfoot. Sometimes the tooth is quiet for hours together, and the checking finds nothing, and the whole business seems to have been smaller than it felt. Then a mouthful of cold water goes over it, and the thin, bright line runs up into the jaw again, sharper this time than it was 3 days ago, holding on for a moment longer before it lets go. Something below the enamel is widening. There is no way to see it, no way to measure it, and no way to stop it, and the only sign that reaches the surface is that the rules the body has been learning are starting, quietly, to change. 2 weeks on, near the top of a hot day, the light comes down almost straight, and the ground gives back heat in a shimmer, and the group has moved into whatever shade the land offers, under an overhang, beneath a stand of trees, in the lee of a boulder that holds the morning's coolness a little longer than the open. Food is passed around and eaten there in the shade, and the eating has changed. It has not changed dramatically, and no one watching would notice much, but the body doing it knows. The tooth has stopped announcing itself at random. It has developed preferences, and it has developed them fast enough that within a fortnight of that first faint evening pressure, a whole set of rules has settled into place around what goes into the mouth and how. Cold is the sharpest of the rules and the one learned first. A mouthful of water drawn from a stream that has come down off higher ground, water cold enough to ache the hands that cup it, produces a response in the tooth that is nearly instant, a bright line of feeling that arrives with the water rather than after it, high and thin and shocking in its speed. Heat behaves differently, and the difference is specific enough to be worth noticing. A piece of meat lifted from the edge of the coals and eaten while it still steams does not produce that bright, fast line. It produces something slower, a swelling ache that builds over a second or two, sits deeper in the jaw, and takes longer to let go once the mouth has cooled. Two sensations from two directions, and the body sorts them apart without needing to be taught. Then there is the third rule, the one that makes no sense at all on its own terms, because it involves no temperature. Ripe fruit, chewed on that side, sets the tooth off. Honey does it worse than anything. Something sweet touching the exposed surface produces a pain nearly as sharp as the cold, arriving out of nothing, from food that is neither hot nor cold, but merely pleasant. The explanation researchers most often favour for all three of these rests on the microscopic tubes running through the dentin, and on the fact that those tubes are not empty. Each one holds fluid. When the enamel above has worn or broken through, the open ends of those tubes meet the mouth, and anything that shifts the fluid inside them tugs on the fine nerve endings waiting at the far end, down in the sheltered hollow where the living heart of the tooth sits. Cold makes the fluid contract and draw outward quickly, and quick movement in those tubes produces the fast, bright signal. Heat pushes the fluid the other way, more slowly, which produces the slower, deeper one. And a strong concentration of sugar sitting on the open surface pulls fluid outward by simple osmosis, drawing it through those tiny channels without any change in temperature whatsoever, which is why a mouthful of honey can hurt a damaged tooth almost as much as meltwater. The nerve itself never learns what caused any of it. It receives movement, and it reports pain, and pain is the only word it knows. Sweetness in this world was not the constant background it has become, and its rarity is part of why honey mattered so much. There was no refined sugar anywhere, no cane and no beet, nothing crystallized or concentrated by any process a person could carry out. What existed was fruit at the peak of ripeness for the few weeks each year that a given plant offered it, figs and berries and whatever the local land produced, sap running in certain trees during certain seasons, and honey, which stood far above all of it. Honey is close to pure sugar and it keeps, and there is direct evidence that people went to considerable trouble for it. Rock paintings in eastern Spain, which researchers have dated in general terms to the period after the last glacial cold, but whose exact age remains debated, appear to show a human figure climbing on ropes or ladders toward a cliff-face nest, surrounded by what look like swarming bees, reaching in with one hand. Similar scenes turn up in rock art elsewhere. The image speaks plainly enough about how much a mouthful of honey was worth. Enough to climb, enough to be stung, enough to be painted onto a wall. And that mouthful, prized and seasonal and hard won, was now among the things this particular body had to think twice about. Around these three rules a quiet negotiation forms, and it runs through every meal. Chewing shifts toward the other side, deliberately at first, and then out of habit. Water gets held in the mouth a moment before swallowing, warmed against the tongue and the palate, or carried in a skin bag through part of the day until the chill has gone out of it. Food off the fire waits longer before it is taken. Something sweet is eaten on the far side, pushed across with the tongue, sometimes swallowed almost whole. None of this is difficult in itself, and none of it takes any thought after the first week. What it takes is a small tax on every mouthful, over and over, from waking to dark. There is a real cost buried in this, and it has nothing to do with the discomfort. In a world where food came from what the land was willing to give on a given day, where a stretch of poor gathering could not be answered by opening a container, eating well when food was there mattered a great deal. A body that eats a little more slowly, that leaves the hardest pieces to others, that stops short of finishing a portion because the chewing has become work rather than the plain business it used to be, is a body taking in less than it otherwise would. The gap is small on any single day. Across weeks it is not small. And the mouth, being the only entrance the body has, means that trouble in a single tooth reaches directly into how much energy a person has for walking, carrying, gathering, and staying warm at night. Today, this stage of the problem is barely a problem. A paste containing potassium salts, used for a week or two, quiets the nerve endings enough that most of the sharpness fades. A thin coat of resin painted over the exposed surface seals the open tubes outright, and the whole business of cold water and honey stops being a consideration by the following month. The negotiation lasts a few weeks and then ends. In the world this account is moving through, the negotiation had no end built into it, and no way to be resolved, and it was left to simply go on. It goes on through that hot afternoon and into the cooler part of the day, the light lengthening and going gold, the heat lifting off the ground in the way it does once the sun is low, the fire built up again for the evening and the smell of it spreading, insects starting up in the grass. And it is during this evening, or an evening close to it, that a small thing changes in a way the body notices immediately, even though it cannot say why it matters. Cold water goes over the tooth, and the bright line arrives, as it always does. Then the water is swallowed, and the mouth is empty and still, and the pain does not switch off. It holds. 2 seconds. 3. A slow fade, rather than a clean stop. The feeling loosening its grip by degrees, instead of vanishing the moment the cause is gone. Every previous time, from the first evening onward, the ache had arrived with the cause and left with it, tied to the thing that produced it. This is the first time it has outlasted its own cause. To the person sitting by that fire, there is no way to know what such a small difference means, and nothing about it feels serious enough to think about for long. Later understanding gives it a name and a weight, because a pain that stops the instant the stimulus is removed and a pain that lingers afterward are treated as signs of two different situations. The second, suggesting that the inflammation has spread beyond the surface layers and reached inward toward the living tissue in the center. The tooth is no longer simply exposed. Something inside it has begun to react. The night comes down and the coals settle, and the tongue makes its slow patrol around the edge of the tooth, finding the same rough shelf it has found for a fortnight. Nothing changed there that any tongue could detect. Nothing to see, nothing to feel, only the small new fact of a pain that took 3 seconds to leave when it used to take none, and the ordinary days going on ahead in their usual order, each one asking the mouth to do the same work it has always done. Some weeks have gone by, enough that the season has shifted a little, and the mornings now come with a thin coolness that was not there before, dew lying on the grass until the sun climbs high enough to lift it. The body wakes and eats what there is to eat at the start of the day, a portion of something from yesterday, roots that were roasted in the coals and left to cool, and the chewing happens entirely on the left side of the mouth, without a single moment of decision going into it. The choice was made weeks ago. It stopped being a choice within days. What began as a careful shifting of each mouthful away from the sore tooth has settled into the plain, unthinking habit of a jaw that now works mostly on one side, and habits of this kind do not stay confined to the thing they were meant to solve. The muscles that close a human jaw are strong out of all proportion to their size. The broad, flat one running down the side of the head above the ear, and the thick one that can be felt bunching at the angle of the jaw when the teeth clench together produce, between them, forces on the back teeth that researchers have measured in the range of many hundreds of newtons in ordinary adults, considerably more in people whose jaws have done heavy work all their lives. That force was built for exactly the kind of eating this world required: long grinding sessions on food that resisted, fibrous roots, meat from animals that ran for a living, lean and tough, needing real work before it would break down, nuts, seeds, dried strips of flesh carried for days. In the ordinary way of things, that force was distributed across both sides of the mouth, more or less evenly, alternating without thought, the load shared between two sets of grinding surfaces so that neither was asked to do the whole job. Now one side is doing nearly all of it. The left molars are taking close to the full daily work of a mouth that has to break down everything a body needs before any of it can be swallowed, and they are taking it hour after hour, day after day, across weeks. Enamel does not complain in the moment. It simply wears, and it wears in proportion to the work asked of it, and the abrasives present in the food. All the grit is still there, the soil clinging to roots, the powder from grinding stones, the hard microscopic silica bodies inside plant tissue, the wind-blown sand, and the fire ash. Every one of those passes now goes across a smaller number of teeth. The consequence of this leaves a mark, and it is a mark researchers can read. Archaeologists studying ancient jaws routinely record how heavily each individual tooth has worn, and in a fair number of specimens the two sides do not match. The molars on one side sit noticeably flatter, more heavily ground down, than their opposite numbers, an asymmetry that would not arise from ordinary balanced chewing. Interpreting any single case is difficult, and researchers are careful about it, since a person might favour one side out of long habit, or because of an old injury, or because of a tooth lost early. But the pattern appears often enough across ancient populations that a mouth avoiding a painful tooth for a long stretch is treated as one plausible cause among several. Under high magnification, the surface of the enamel itself carries even finer information, a landscape of microscopic scratches and pits left by particles dragged across it during chewing, and the study of these traces has become a field of its own. Long parallel striations tend to indicate hard abrasive material moved across the surface under load, and the direction of the scratches carries information about the movement of the jaw as it happened. A tooth doing double duty accumulates these faster than its resting counterpart, and the record of that imbalance is written in a surface too small to see. There is a second consequence, and it runs in the opposite direction from what one might expect. The side that has been spared is not doing well either. Chewing is the mouth's own cleaning, in a rough but genuine way. The mechanical scrubbing of tough fibrous material across a tooth surface removes some of the soft film that gathers on it, and the act of chewing drives a strong flow of saliva, which washes, dilutes, and carries a set of substances that slow bacterial growth. A side of the mouth that has fallen idle receives far less of all this. The film on those teeth thickens undisturbed, hardens into the mineral crust that presses against the gums, and the gums respond by inflaming and drawing further back. The tooth that was protected from work is being quietly damaged by rest, and there is no possible way for the person to know it. Every action taken in good faith against the original problem has produced a second problem somewhere else in the same mouth. The jaw joint itself, sitting just in front of each ear, is a further place where the imbalance collects. It is a joint that carries load with every bite, and its two sides are meant to work as a matched pair. Weeks of one-sided grinding load one joint heavily and leave the other underused, and while it would be going beyond the evidence to claim any particular outcome for any particular ancient person, joint discomfort, stiffness on waking, and a jaw that aches after a long meal are all common enough consequences of sustained one-sided chewing to be worth setting alongside everything else this tooth has begun to cost. Compensation goes beyond the mouth too, out into how food is handled before it ever gets there. Cooking longer softens what is tough, and a root left in the coals well past the point where it was already edible comes out yielding easily. Meat pounded between two stones breaks down before any tooth touches it. Fibrous material can be soaked, or beaten, or cut into smaller portions with a flake of stone worked to an edge. There is a related habit worth mentioning here, one that shows up plainly in the archaeological record. Human teeth were used for far more than eating. Ancient front teeth, particularly in Neanderthal specimens, frequently show heavy wear, chipping, and fine-cut marks on their outer surfaces, and the widely favoured interpretation is that material was gripped between the front teeth and worked with a stone tool held in one hand, hide and sinew and plant fibre pulled taut and sliced close to the lips, the blade occasionally scoring the enamel behind it. The mouth was a third hand. A mouth that hurts is a hand that has been partly taken away, and the small daily jobs that depended on gripping and pulling with the teeth become harder alongside everything else. The picture that gathers here is of a body absorbing a single localized failure by spreading the cost outward across many systems, none of which was designed to carry it. One tooth stops working, the other side wears faster, the idle side deteriorates from disuse. One joint takes double load. Food must be processed longer, which takes time and fuel. Certain tasks that use the front teeth grow awkward, and all of this proceeds without any of it being visible, without any of it being measurable, and without any of it being reversible, since the material lost from every one of those surfaces is enamel, and enamel does not come back. Today, an aching tooth is caught within a couple of visits, and the compensating habits fade away on their own once the source is gone, before the wear pattern has time to become anything a person would notice in the mirror. Here it simply accumulates. The day passes, and the light goes long and orange across the ground, and the group settles toward the evening meal, the fire built up, meat set near the coals, the smell of it carrying. And this is when the tooth does something it has not done before. There is no cold water in the mouth. There is nothing sweet, nothing hot, nothing being chewed at all. The body is sitting still in the warmth of the fire with an empty mouth, and the pain arrives anyway. It comes up from underneath rather than down from the surface, deeper than the bright thin line that cold produces, a dull heavy throb that seems to fill the whole back corner of the jaw rather than sitting in one identifiable tooth. It builds for a moment, holds, and eases back, and then some while later, it does it again. Every episode of pain since that first evening, weeks ago, has been an answer to something. Something touched the tooth, and the tooth responded, and when the touching stopped, the response stopped with it. This is the first pain that has no cause outside the mouth at all. The tongue goes to the tooth out of habit and finds nothing new there, the same rough shelf it has been checking for weeks, and the throb continues on its own schedule, ignoring the tongue entirely, arriving and receding on some rhythm that belongs to the inside of the tooth and to nothing else. The fire burns down toward its coals, and the cold comes up out of the ground the way it does once full dark has settled, and the body lies down among the others, and the throbbing goes on quietly in the dark, keeping its own time, no longer waiting to be asked. A month has passed since that first evening, near enough, and the season has moved further along, the mornings arriving with real cold in them now, a whiteness on the grass in the low places that burns off within an hour of the sun clearing the horizon. The group is already at work in the strengthening light. The flat tap of one stone worked against another carrying across the camp, a hide pegged out and being scraped, someone away at the water. The body is among them doing what it does, and the whole of its attention is somewhere else entirely, because the throb that arrived unbidden by the fire some evenings ago has not gone away, and has instead become the organizing fact of every hour. It has a rhythm now, and the rhythm is recognizable. It rises and falls in a steady beat, and the beat matches something the body already knows, the same pulse that can be felt in the neck after a hard climb, the same one that thumps in the ears in the moment before sleep. Each surge of it presses, holds a fraction of a second, and releases, only to build again. Whatever is happening inside that tooth is now keeping time with the heart. The reason for this sits in a piece of anatomy that is simple to describe and merciless in its consequences. At the center of every tooth there is a hollow chamber, and inside that chamber lies the pulp, the living core, a soft tissue holding the nerve, and a small supply of blood vessels that enter through a narrow opening at the very tip of the root. Everywhere else, that chamber is enclosed by dentin, and outside the dentin by enamel, which is to say the living heart of a tooth sits inside a rigid box built of the hardest material the human body makes. When any other tissue in the body becomes inflamed, it swells. A twisted ankle puffs out. An infected cut rises and tightens against the skin. The swelling is uncomfortable, but the tissue has somewhere to expand into, and the pressure inside stays within limits the body can tolerate. Pulp cannot do this. Inflammation drives more blood into the chamber, and fluid leaks out of the vessels into the surrounding tissue exactly as it would anywhere else, and the walls do not yield by even a fraction. Pressure builds inside a sealed space with a nerve trapped in it, and no route of escape except a hole at the root tip narrow enough to be measured in fractions of a millimeter. That is what produces the beat. Every contraction of the heart sends a fresh push of blood into a chamber that is already overfull. The pressure inside spikes against the nerve and then falls slightly as the pulse passes and rises again with the next one, minute after minute, hour after hour, for as long as the heart continues doing the only thing it knows how to do. Anything that drives blood faster or harder makes it worse. Climbing a slope with a load, carrying water back from the stream, bending to lift something from the ground, sitting close in to the heat of a fire, all of these announce themselves in the tooth within seconds. And the rules the body spent the previous weeks learning have now reversed themselves, which is disorienting in its own quiet way. Heat, which was merely a slow, deep ache when the trouble sat in the outer layers, has become the worst thing that can happen to that side of the mouth. Hot food producing a surge that goes on long after the mouthful is gone. Cold, which was the sharpest enemy of all, has turned into something close to relief. A mouthful of stream water, cold enough to numb the lips, held still against that side and not swallowed, damps the throbbing down for as long as it stays there. The observation is consistent enough that it is used today as a diagnostic sign. A patient who arrives holding a container of cold water, having already told the clinician a great deal before saying a word. In that older world, the discovery arrives by accident, from a mouthful of water taken for thirst, and it becomes a thing the body returns to over and over through the day, walking down to the stream more often than thirst requires. There is a second change, and it is stranger than the first. The pain has begun to lose its address. For a month, the tooth had been findable. The tongue could go to it, press the rough shelf on its surface, and confirm that the trouble lived there and nowhere else. Now the throb fills a whole region, the back of the jaw, up along the side of the face, into the ear, sometimes reaching the temple, and pressing the original tooth with the tongue produces nothing in particular. The body can no longer say with any confidence which tooth is the one. This has an explanation in the way the face is wired. Sensation from the teeth, the jaw, the ear, and much of the side of the head is carried by branches of a single large nerve, and those branches converge as they run inward toward the brain, many fine inputs feeding into far fewer pathways. The brain interprets what arrives, and where the signal is strong and unrelenting, and comes from a place it has little practice localizing, it does the best it can and assigns the pain to a general district rather than a precise point. Pain from a lower tooth is regularly felt in an upper one, or in the ear, or across a whole side of the head. A person with a failing tooth today may point confidently at the wrong tooth, and the confusion is only resolved by tapping each one in turn and watching the response, or by an image made through the jaw. The person by that fire has no way to resolve it at all. The thing hurting them has stopped having a location, and a pain without a location is much harder to hold at arm's length than one that can be pointed at. What this does to a day is the part that matters most for a body living the way this one lives. Nothing in that life happened by itself. Food had to be found, dug, carried, processed. Water had to be fetched. Firewood had to be gathered before dark, and the fire kept. Hides needed working while they were still fresh enough to work. Children had to be watched. And underneath all of it ran a constant low requirement to pay attention to the surroundings, because the landscape held animals with their own intentions and the weather turned without asking. Pain of this kind takes attention the way a leak takes water. It is not that any single task becomes impossible. It is that every task is now performed by a body that is spending a large share of its available attention on a throbbing in its own head that startles more slowly, that stops to hold cold water in its mouth, that finishes less than it began, and that arrives at the end of the day more tired than the work alone would explain. Sustained pain interferes with rest, and poor rest lowers the tolerance for pain the following day, and the two feed each other in a loop that tightens rather than settles. In a group where the day's food came from what the day's work produced, a person spending themselves this way was a real cost, carried by everyone. And here is a thing worth holding on to, because it changes the shape of the whole picture. None of this was mysterious to the people watching it happen. A pattern like this one, running from a first small ache through weeks of sensitivity to the throbbing that arrives on its own and swallows a person's attention, would have been thoroughly familiar to anyone who had lived a reasonable number of years among others. They would have seen it before, more than once. They would have known roughly what came next, and how long it tended to last, and how it tended to end. There is no way to recover what they said about it or what they believed caused it, and inventing that would be going well past the evidence. But the sequence itself was old, and common, and recognized, and that recognition is its own kind of knowledge, arrived at the only way it could be, by watching it happen to person after person over generations. Today, the throbbing stage is where the matter gets settled outright. The chamber is opened, the inflamed tissue inside removed, the space cleaned and sealed, and the pain that was rising with every heartbeat stops that afternoon and does not return. A single visit closes a door that would otherwise stay open indefinitely. That door stayed open. The day works its way toward evening, the light thinning, the cold sharpening again as the sun drops, smoke from the built-up fire hanging low in the settling air. Water is fetched a final time and held in the mouth, and it helps the way it has been helping. Food is eaten, or partly eaten. The throb goes on keeping its steady time under everything, unchanged by any of it, and the body begins to do what bodies do when the light goes, which is to look toward lying down. There is a small piece of knowledge waiting on the other side of that, one this body has not yet acquired, though a month of nights has been leading toward it. The hours after dark do not treat a tooth like this one the way the daylight hours do, and the difference is not a matter of quiet, or of having nothing else to think about, and it does not depend on being alone with it. Something changes in the physical situation inside that sealed chamber the moment a head goes down toward the ground, and it changes for reasons that have been true for every night of this month, without ever mattering until now. Full dark comes early now, and it comes cold. The fire has been built up for the evening, and the group has drawn in around it, close enough that the side of a body facing the flames grows almost uncomfortably warm, while the side facing away stays chilled. And beyond the light, the ground has already begun giving up the last of the day's heat into a clear sky, with nothing in it to hold the warmth down. Bedding is what the land provided, and what could be carried. Dry grass gathered and heaped, a hide laid over it, another pulled across the body, the whole arrangement flat against ground that was cold before the sunset and grows colder through the night. The body lowers itself onto that surface, and the head goes down, and within the space of a few breaths the throbbing in the jaw steps up in force, unmistakably, as though something has been added to it in the act of lying down. The explanation is a matter of plumbing and gravity. Blood returning from the head to the heart does so largely without any pump behind it, relying instead on pressure differences and on the simple fact that, in a body standing or sitting upright, the head sits above the heart and gravity assists the drainage. Lie flat, and that assistance disappears. Pressure in the veins of the head rises, and the tissues there hold a little more blood than they did while the body was upright, which most people experience harmlessly as the puffiness of a face just after waking. In a sealed chamber already over full, already inflamed, already pressing on a nerve with nowhere to go, that same modest rise in pressure is delivered directly onto the one structure that cannot accommodate it. The throb that kept steady time all day becomes something heavier, fuller, and closer to continuous. The gaps between the beats filling in, there is a second thing running alongside it, tied to the daily cycle the body keeps whether or not anyone attends to it. Cortisol, a hormone the body produces on a strong daily rhythm, has among its many effects the damping of inflammation, and its levels in most people fall to their lowest point through the early and middle hours of the night, before climbing again toward morning. The body's own restraint on inflammation is at its weakest exactly when the head is down and the pressure is up. Researchers studying pain report that sensitivity itself follows a daily rhythm as well, with tolerance for pain generally lowest in the small hours. None of these effects is enormous taken alone. Stacked on top of one another, arriving together every night, they produce the thing that anyone who has ever had a tooth go bad already knows without needing to be told. The night is worse, and it is worse for reasons that have nothing to do with having time to dwell on it. Lying beside a fire, in a cold season, the situation acquires a further turn. Heat makes it worse, and heat is the one thing available. Move closer to the coals for warmth, and the throbbing rises within minutes. Move away, and the cold arrives instead, seeping up through grass and hide from ground that is pulling warmth out of the body all night long. The choice runs both ways, and neither way is right, and it is made again and again through the dark hours, shifting nearer and then further, never settling. A person today reaches for two remedies at exactly this point, and both of them are so ordinary they hardly register as remedies at all. The first is to prop the head up on something, a second pillow, a folded arm of a chair, anything that restores a little of the height the upright body had. And it works, modestly, for precisely the reason described above. The second sits in a cupboard and takes effect within the hour. On a flat bed of grass under a hide, there is nothing to prop a head against that would make any difference, and there is nothing at all to take. What the night does to sleep is the part that carries forward into everything after. Sleep is not a single flat state, but a cycle that has to be built, moving down through lighter stages into the deep, slow-wave sleep where the body does most of its physical restoration, then up toward lighter sleep again, the whole loop repeating several times before morning. Reaching the deep portion takes uninterrupted time. Pain of this kind does not necessarily prevent falling asleep, since exhaustion is a powerful thing, but it surfaces a person repeatedly, pulling them up out of the descent before the deep stage arrives, and each surfacing means the climb down has to start again from the beginning. A night spent in this pattern can total a respectable number of hours with almost none of the deep sleep in it. The body wakes having rested far less than the hours would suggest, and one of the well-documented consequences of insufficient deep sleep is a measurable drop in pain tolerance the following day. The same hurt, unchanged in itself, registers as worse. That worse pain then makes the next night harder, which lowers tolerance further, and the loop closes and begins to turn. Across the small hours, the sounds of the surrounding land go on regardless. Something moves in the dry grass beyond the firelight and stops. The wind changes direction, and the smoke shifts with it. A child stirs and settles. The fire drops from flame to a low bed of coals that pulse orange under a skin of ash and no longer throw much light at all. And through it there is the specific work of holding still, because the bodies pressed nearby are asleep and the warmth they share is worth having. So the shifting is done slowly and the sounds are kept in. There is nowhere in this world to take a bad night away to. Whatever passed between the people around that fire cannot be recovered, and putting words in their mouths would be going beyond anything the evidence supports. What can be said is that the situation was visible. A person who does not sleep, in a group sleeping within arm's reach, is not doing so privately. The cold reaches its worst in the last stretch before dawn, when the ground has given up everything it had and the sky has taken it, and frost forms on the grass beyond the coals. Somewhere in that stretch, sleep may finally come properly, an hour or two of it, deep and thick with exhaustion. Then the light begins, grey and slow, birds starting up in the cold, and the body surfaces from it far too soon, into a day that will ask for the same walking and carrying and gathering as every other day, because the land does not adjust its terms. Several nights of this run together into one long condition. Judgment blunts, the reaction slow, appetite drops away at the same time as the mouth has already made eating difficult, and the two shortfalls add together. The steady low toll of it reaches everything a person does. And then, somewhere in this stretch of nights, the pattern that has held for weeks does something no one is expecting, because it stops getting worse. There is no single moment to point at. Over the course of a few days, the throbbing loses some of its force. The nights grow easier by degrees, the cold water is reached for less often, and a body that has been braced against this thing for a month begins, cautiously, to unbrace. The pain is going. Nothing was done to make it go. It is simply, quietly, receding, and the reason it is receding has nothing to do with anything getting better. The morning that follows is the first one in weeks that does not begin with the jaw. The body surfaces out of a stretch of genuine sleep, several hours of it, and lies there in the grey light with something missing, and it takes a moment to identify what the missing thing is. The tongue goes to the tooth and finds the same rough shelf it has been finding since the beginning, and presses it, and the tooth returns almost nothing, a dull, far-off note where a month of sharp answers used to live. Outside, frost is on the grass in the shaded places, and the air is still enough that smoke from the revived fire climbs straight up before spreading flat at some height above the camp. Water is fetched and drunk cold, straight down, without any thought given to which side of the mouth it runs over. Food is eaten on the right side, testing it, and the right side accepts the work. Over the next several days, the improvement holds and deepens. The throbbing that kept time with the heart does not return. Nights become ordinary again, the head going down onto grass, and hide without the pressure rising to meet it. The cold water trips to the stream stop. Chewing gradually redistributes, not fully, since a month of habit does not undo itself in a week, but enough that meals stop being negotiations. A body that has been braced for a long time unbraces, and the tiredness that comes off it in those first restored nights is considerable. By every measure available to the person living inside it, the thing has ended. What has actually happened inside the tooth is the opposite of ending. The pulp, sealed in its rigid chamber, has spent weeks under pressure it had no way to relieve, and its entire blood supply enters through a single narrow opening at the tip of the root. Rising pressure inside the chamber presses on those small vessels from the outside. When that pressure exceeds what the vessels can push against, blood stops moving through them. Tissue that receives no blood does not survive, and pulp is no exception. So at some point in that stretch of worse nights, the living tissue in the center of the tooth died, and the nerve inside it died along with everything else. There is no signal left to send. The silence is not repair. It is the absence of anything remaining to report. This is a well-recognized stage in the modern understanding of a failing tooth, and clinicians treat this particular quiet with more concern than the pain that came before it, because the pain at least indicated tissue still alive enough to complain. What sits inside that chamber now is dead tissue in a warm, moist, enclosed space that the body's defenses cannot reach. Blood carries the immune system, and there is no longer any blood flow into that chamber. White cells cannot get in. Nothing the body might mobilize against an infection can be delivered to a place its own circulation no longer serves. Bacteria that worked their way down through the softened dentin over the preceding weeks now occupy a sealed chamber with a supply of dead tissue and no opposition whatsoever, and they multiply there in conditions close to ideal, in the dark, at steady body temperature, undisturbed. The tooth has become a container, and a container has an opening. The same narrow hole at the root tip that once admitted the blood supply is still there, and it opens directly into the socket of bone that holds the tooth in the jaw. Through that opening, over days and weeks, the contents of the chamber begin to move outward. Bacteria, the products they generate, the breakdown material of dead tissue, they pass out of the tooth and into the small space at the tip of the root. And there, for the first time in this entire sequence, they meet living tissue with a working blood supply and an immune system fully able to respond. What follows is not a quiet process. It is simply one happening in a place that has no nerve endings sensitive enough to report it clearly yet. Bone is not the inert scaffolding it appears to be. It is living tissue, remodeled continuously throughout life by cells that build it up and other cells that break it down, and the balance between them shifts in response to conditions. Sustained inflammation at the root tip tips that balance decisively toward breakdown, and bone begins to be dissolved away in a small region around the opening. This produces a cavity in the jaw, filled with inflammatory tissue and fluid, expanding slowly outward from the root. It is the reason a modern image made through the jaw of a tooth in this condition shows a dark rounded shadow where solid bone should be, and it is why such a shadow is treated as significant even when the patient reports no pain at all. The shadow takes weeks to months to develop, and it develops in silence. In a mouth in this older world, nothing announced it. There is no ache, no swelling visible from outside, no change the tongue can locate, no reason of any kind for a person to think the matter is unfinished. The visible evidence of this stage survives, and archaeologists encounter it regularly. Ancient jaws recovered from sites across a very long span of time frequently carry small rounded holes in the bone near the roots of teeth. Openings that formed as an infection at a root tip expanded until it broke through the outer surface of the jaw. The lesions are common enough in ancient remains that researchers studying the health of past populations record them as a standard category, and they are visible to the naked eye in a recovered jaw, small dark openings in bone that is otherwise smooth. That such lesions had time to form and to grow large enough to breach the bone is itself informative. The process ran for a long stretch of a person's life without being stopped, because there was nothing available to stop it. Something else worth setting here, since this is the point in the sequence where the mouth stops being only the mouth. The blood vessels serving the teeth and jaws are connected to the rest of the body's circulation like every other vessel, and an infection established in the bone of the jaw sits alongside that circulation rather than apart from it. Modern medicine takes dental infections seriously for exactly this reason, and while the serious complications are uncommon today because the underlying infection is normally treated long before it could develop, the pathways themselves are anatomical facts that were as true in the deep past as they are now. What that meant for any particular ancient person cannot be stated, and claiming a specific outcome would go past the evidence. What can be stated is that the infection had somewhere to go, the days go on, and the season deepens. The frost stays later into the morning now. The light comes shorter at both ends, and the work continues, and the body doing it feels well. It sleeps. It eats on both sides again. It carries water up from the stream without the climb announcing itself in the jaw. Weeks of this pass, and the whole episode recedes into the ordinary background of things that happened and ended, filed away with all the other small hurts a body collects and forgets. And a modest hollow in the bone of the jaw, at the tip of one root, continues doing what it has been doing since the pain stopped, slowly, without any sensation attached to it, taking a little more bone each week. Somewhere in that quiet stretch a threshold sits, invisible from either side of it, where the expanding pocket has finally taken enough bone that the wall containing it has thinned to almost nothing. The body walks around in the cold, clear days on the far side of a month of pain, entirely unaware that the thing it survived did not stop, and that it has been keeping a slow appointment ever since. The cold season is well established by now, the ground hard in the mornings, and slow to soften, the days short enough that the work has to be fitted into a narrower window of light, and food coming in thinner than it did. Whatever the land offered in abundance has been eaten or has gone, and what remains takes longer to find and yields less when found. This matters to what happens next, though nothing about it looks connected. A body under sustained strain, eating less than it needs, sleeping cold, working through short grey days, does not defend itself as well as a body that is warm and fed. The immune response depends on resources like everything else, and researchers studying nutrition and infection have documented the connection often enough that the general principle is well established, even if the details vary between individuals and situations. A pocket of infection that has been held in a rough standstill for weeks, contained but never cleared, does not need much to shift out of that standstill. The shift, when it comes, announces itself in a way that has nothing in common with the pain that came before. It begins as a vague awareness that something on that side of the jaw is wrong again. No throbbing, no reaction to cold water, no answer at all when the tongue presses the rough shelf of the tooth. What there is instead is a feeling of pressure from underneath the tooth, deep in the gum, and one strange detail that arrives with it. The tooth has begun to feel taller. Biting down brings that one tooth into contact with its opposite number a fraction before the others. And that contact hurts, a sharp, bright pain quite unlike anything from the previous stage, arriving only with pressure and stopping the moment the pressure stops. There is a real anatomical reason for this, and it lies in a structure that has not mattered until now. A tooth does not sit rigidly fused into the jaw. It is suspended in its socket by a thin layer of fibrous tissue called the periodontal ligament. Thousands of small fibers running from the root surface to the bone of the socket wall, holding the tooth in a sling that allows it to move very slightly under load and cushions the force of every bite. That ligament is richly supplied with nerves, and unlike the interior of a tooth, it is very good at telling the brain exactly where it is. When the infection from the dead chamber pushes out through the root tip into the surrounding tissue, that ligament becomes inflamed, and inflamed tissue swells, and swelling in the narrow space between root and bone pushes the tooth minutely upward out of its socket. A fraction of a millimeter is enough. The tooth now meets the opposing tooth first and takes the full force of the bite on an inflamed suspension, which is why biting produces sharp localized pain in a tooth that has been dead and silent for weeks. It is also why the pain has an address again. The body can point at it now, precisely, in a way it could not during the throbbing month, because a different tissue with a different nerve supply is doing the reporting. Meanwhile, the pocket at the root tip is doing something the body cannot detect at all. The immune response mounted against the bacteria arriving through the root opening produces enormous numbers of white cells, which travel to the site and are destroyed there in the fighting, and the accumulation of dead white cells, bacteria, dissolved tissue, and fluid is what forms pus. It is a byproduct of a defense working, and it collects because the body has no route to remove it and no way to reach the source, which remains sealed inside a tooth its circulation no longer serves. Pus takes up space, and it takes that space from bone, dissolved away steadily around the expanding pocket. The pressure inside such a collection can be considerable, and pressure needs somewhere to go. And what determines where it goes is nothing more complicated than the shape of the bone around it. The jaw is not uniformly thick. The outer plate of bone on the cheek side of a lower back tooth tends to be thinner than the plate on the tongue side in many positions, while the situation reverses in others, and the roots of different teeth sit at different depths and angles within the bone. An expanding collection follows the path of least resistance, working through whichever wall is thinnest and nearest, and the direction it takes has real consequences, because on the far side of one wall is the inside of the mouth, where a collection can eventually break through, drain, and relieve itself, and on the far side of another are the spaces between the muscles of the face and neck, where a collection has considerably more room to spread. In this instance, the pressure works toward the outer wall of the jaw, on the cheek side, through bone that has already been thinned by weeks of quiet resorption. Over the course of days, the pain shifts and grows. The sharpness on biting is joined by a constant ache, no longer only in the tooth, spreading through the bone of the jaw itself, present without stimulus and unaffected by anything the mouth does or does not do. It is a heavy, boring pain, deeper and duller than the throbbing month, and the body's response to it is to stop using that side entirely, not through the negotiated adjustments of earlier weeks, but completely, the jaw held slightly apart, the teeth kept from meeting, eating reduced to whatever can be managed on the other side without any real closure of the bite. Chewing pushes on the inflamed ligament, so chewing becomes something to avoid, and food intake drops sharply at exactly the point in the year when it was already low, and when a body defending itself against an active infection needs more energy rather than less. That is the shape of the situation now, and it is a poor one, an infection that flared partly because the body was depleted, causing a level of pain that further reduces what the body can take in a season that has little to offer in the first place. Along with this comes the first sign that the trouble is no longer confined to one place at all. The lymph nodes under the jaw, which filter fluid draining from the mouth and face, and are part of the system that mounts a response to infection, begin to swell and become tender, and can be felt as small, firm lumps beneath the jawline where nothing was noticeable before. This is a normal and expected response, and it is also information. It indicates a body responding to something at a scale beyond the local. There may be a general unwellness alongside it, the flat, depleted feeling that accompanies any infection the body is working hard against, and the warmth of a mild fever, though how any of this would have been understood by the people around that fire cannot be recovered, and inventing an explanation for them would go well past what any evidence supports. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the situation was recognizable, because the sequence from a tooth going quiet to a jaw beginning to swell is common, and had been common for a very long time. The archaeological record supports that ordinariness plainly. Jaws bearing the small rounded openings left by abscesses that drained through bone are recovered routinely from ancient sites, in individuals of many ages and from many regions and time periods. Researchers examining ancient skeletal collections record them as a matter of course, and in some studied populations a substantial share of adults show at least one such lesion. Setting aside every difficulty of interpretation, and there are several, the plain frequency of the finding indicates that what is happening in this jaw was a thoroughly ordinary event in human life, repeated across an enormous number of individuals over an enormous span of time. Today it is stopped within a day. The collection is opened and drained, the pressure relieved almost immediately, and a course of antibiotics brings the infection under control, while the dead chamber inside the tooth is cleaned out, or the tooth removed, and the entire matter is finished within a week. Nothing in that sequence existed here. The days go on, and the pressure continues to build, and the cold deepens with them, frost lying unmelted in the shaded ground all day now, breath showing white in the morning air, the fire needing more wood than it did a month ago. The pain has settled into something continuous that no position relieves and no cold water touches. And in the last day or two, something has begun to change on the outside, so slight that it might be nothing, a fullness along the line of the jaw where the bone should be felt clearly beneath the skin, and now cannot quite be found. The pocket has been expanding through bone for weeks with nothing to show for it. It has nearly finished with the bone. The thing that had been building under the bone finishes what it was doing sometime in the night, and the body knows it has happened without knowing what it was. There is an hour in the dark when the pain climbs past everything that came before it, sharp and enormous and filling the whole side of the head, tight in a way that feels like the jaw is being pushed apart from the inside. Then, over the following hour, it eases, not away, but down, from something unbearable to something merely bad. And the easing is the signal that the pressure has found somewhere to go. The layer immediately covering bone is a thin, tough membrane, richly supplied with nerves and bound tightly to the surface beneath it, and a collection of fluid forcing its way between that membrane and the bone lifts it away from what it is anchored to. That lifting is understood today to be among the more severe pains the head can produce, and it lasts only as long as the membrane holds. Once the collection breaks through into the softer tissue beyond, the pressure spreads out into a space with room in it, and the worst of the sharpness goes out of the pain, even though the infection itself has advanced rather than retreated. By grey light the change is visible from outside. The jawline on that side has lost its edge. Where the bone should stand out clearly under the skin, there is now a smooth fullness, warm to the touch and firm rather than soft, and it has come up quickly enough that the difference between the two sides of the face is plain to anyone looking. Over the day it grows. The swelling spreads upward along the cheek and outward, the skin over it stretched and shiny, tender to any pressure, and by evening it has begun to encroach on the lower lid of the eye on that side, narrowing it. Inside the mouth, the gum beside the tooth has risen into a soft dome that the tongue finds immediately and does not want to touch twice. There is a further consequence, and this one has more practical weight than the appearance. The muscles that close the jaw sit close in behind the back teeth, and inflammation reaching the tissue near them provokes a protective spasm that a person has no voluntary control over. The jaw stops opening, not entirely, but the gap that can be achieved between the front teeth shrinks from the width of several fingers to something much smaller, and forcing it produces pain that ends the attempt. This is recognized as a warning sign in modern clinical practice, since a jaw that will not open indicates the infection has reached beyond the immediate area of the tooth and into the spaces around the muscles. What it meant in this older world was simpler and more immediate. A mouth that opens a finger's width takes food in slowly, in small pieces, and only food that requires no real chewing. Drinking becomes awkward. Speech is thickened and hard to shape, the words coming out flattened by a jaw that will not move properly and a tongue working around a swollen floor of the mouth. And there is a further indignity in it, since swallowing itself becomes uncomfortable, so saliva that would ordinarily be swallowed without any thought, instead collects and spills. Which direction the swelling takes is determined by a piece of anatomy that has nothing to do with the infection at all. A ridge of bone runs along the inner surface of the lower jaw, and a broad flat muscle forming the floor of the mouth attaches along it. The roots of the back teeth sit at varying depths relative to that ridge, some ending above it and some below, and a collection breaking out of the bone above the line spreads into the floor of the mouth, while one breaking out below the line passes beneath that muscle and into the space under the jaw in the upper neck. Nothing in this depends on anything a person did. It is a matter of the length of one root and the height of one ridge in one particular jaw, decided long before the tooth ever began to fail, and it separates a swelling that stays in the face from one that has access to the neck. That distinction is why dental infection continues to be taken seriously in modern medicine, and why the location of a swelling is assessed before anything else. The archaeological record preserves the aftermath of this stage rather than the stage itself, and what it preserves is instructive. Ancient jaws frequently show the small rounded openings left where collections broke through the outer bone, and in a good number of specimens the margins of those openings are smooth and rounded rather than sharp, which researchers interpret as bone that continued living and remodeling for a considerable period afterward. Some jaws carry several such openings at different teeth, at different stages of remodeling, indicating a mouth that went through this sequence more than once across a life. Others show extensive bone loss around a tooth position together with a socket that has partly filled in, the pattern left behind when a tooth was lost and the bone slowly closed over the space. These are not the remains of rare catastrophes. They are the ordinary marks of ordinary mouths, and they turn up across a very wide range of periods and places. The days that follow are governed entirely by the swelling. The heat of it can be felt with a hand held near the skin. Lying down is difficult because the position that made the earlier throbbing worse does the same to this, and the head is kept propped on whatever is available: a rolled hide, a forearm, the slope of the ground. Sleep comes in fragments through the coldest nights of the year, and food goes in at a fraction of what a body working in the cold requires, at the exact point in the season when what is available has already thinned. Water is easier than food, and becomes most of what is taken in. There is a whole body dimension to it that reaches beyond the jaw. A body mounting a response of this size runs a fever, and fever is metabolically expensive, raising the rate at which energy is burned, and it produces the flat, heavy exhaustion that flattens out the desire to move or eat at all. The lymph nodes beneath the jaw have grown and can be felt as firm, tender lumps. The person is unwell in the general sense now, not simply in possession of a bad tooth. And all of this is happening in front of everyone. A swollen face cannot be kept private in a group living within arm's reach, sharing a fire, sleeping in a cluster against the cold. Whatever was said or done about it in any particular case cannot be recovered, and no evidence supports inventing it. What the material record does show, and shows repeatedly, is that individuals in the deep past survived injuries and conditions that would have made them dependent on others for extended periods, healed fractures that would have required long immobility, severe conditions with clear signs of long-term survival afterward, individuals who lost most of their teeth and lived on for years in a state that would have required food to be prepared differently for them. The inference researchers commonly draw from such finds, cautiously, is that care of some kind was extended. Whether that inference holds in every case remains debated, and the debate is a genuine one. Taken as a body of evidence, though, it suggests that a person in the condition described here was not simply left to whatever came next. Today this stage is a same-day matter. The collection is opened and drained, the pressure gone within minutes, antibiotics started immediately, and the swelling is visibly reduced by the following morning. In the world this account moves through, there was no opening it, and the swelling was left to follow its own course, which it does. Over the following days it stops growing outward and becomes something else, less firm at its centre, softer under a finger, the tension in the stretched skin above it changing. The heat remains. The pain shifts again in character, less the tight pressure of the past days, and more a deep, insistent soreness. And the fever holds through the cold nights, so that the body lies among the others with the frost forming beyond the coals. Burning energy it does not have to spare against something that is no longer contained by the jaw at all, and no longer answerable by anything the mouth might do or refuse to do. By the third or fourth day of it, the fever has taken over the running of the body, and the first thing it does is turn the cold season into something worse than it already was. Fever works by moving a setting rather than by adding heat directly. A region deep in the brain holds the temperature the body aims to maintain, and substances released during an immune response shift that target upward, after which everything the body does to defend its temperature is aimed at the new number instead of the old one. The consequence is a peculiar cruelty. A body running hot feels cold. The skin draws blood inward and goes pale and clammy. The small muscles begin the deep involuntary shivering that generates heat, and the person lies as close to the fire as the swelling in their face will allow, wrapped in whatever hides the group has, and is cold in a way that no amount of fire answers. Anyone touching them finds them burning. What that costs is not small. Maintaining a raised temperature increases the rate at which the body burns energy substantially, and the shivering itself is muscular work with a real price attached. So a body already eating a fraction of what it needs is now spending considerably more than it did before falling ill. The reserves come out of muscle, since that is what the body breaks down when there is not enough coming in, and the depletion moves quickly in a person who had little to spare at the start of a hard season. Alongside it runs a fluid problem that is quieter and arrives faster than the food problem. Fever drives water out through the skin and through faster breathing, and this body cannot open its mouth properly to drink, cannot swallow comfortably, and is losing saliva it would ordinarily reabsorb without any thought. Water was the one thing the landscape could still provide in quantity, and it is water that is going out. Dehydration thickens the blood, drops the pressure driving it, and produces the dry mouth and headache and thin fast pulse that go along with it, and the body compensates by driving the heart faster to keep the pressure up, which shows as a pulse that can be felt going quickly at the throat even while lying still. And here the infection begins to move in ways that reach past the jaw entirely. Bacteria and their products entering the bloodstream from an established site is a recognized event, and in a great many cases the body clears them without any drama at all. When the load is large enough, or the body depleted enough, the response itself becomes the problem. The immune system mounts a reaction across the whole body rather than at one site. Blood vessels widen everywhere at once. Fluid leaks out of them into the tissues, blood pressure falls, and organs that depend on steady flow begin to receive less than they need. Modern medicine calls this sepsis and treats it as an emergency. And the reason dental infection is still handled with urgency in a world of antibiotics is that this pathway has never closed. It is simply interrupted almost always long before it arrives. There are other routes as well, and they are worth naming because they explain why a swollen jaw is assessed so carefully today. An infection spreading through the soft tissue of the floor of the mouth and the upper neck can push the tongue upward and backward and swell the tissues around the airway, and the danger there is mechanical rather than microbial. The veins of the face drain in a pattern that includes connections running toward the interior of the skull, and infection traveling that way is rare but recognized. None of these outcomes is a certainty, and none of them follows automatically from a swollen face. and a great many such swellings resolve on their own. Bodies do fight this off, but the pathways are anatomy, and anatomy does not change across time. So whatever was true of them then is what is true of them now, minus everything modern medicine puts in the way. A gap in the evidence deserves to be stated plainly here, because it shapes how the deep past looks to us. Bone records only what it has time to record. The rounded openings and the hollowed sockets and the smooth margins found in ancient jaws are the marks of infections that ran for many weeks or months, slow enough for living bone to respond and remodel around them. An infection that moved quickly from a swollen face to a body-wide crisis in the space of a week leaves the skeleton looking almost untouched, since bone cannot remodel that fast. Researchers working with ancient remains are well aware of this, and it means the visible dental damage in the archaeological record represents the cases that were survived, or at least endured for a long time, while the ones that ended fastest are the ones least likely to have left any legible trace at all. What we can see is a record of endurance. What it does not show cannot be counted, and honest work on the subject says so, rather than filling the gap with a number. The days themselves proceed slowly and without much in them. Full daylight is short, and the body spends most of it lying near the fire in a state that is not quite sleep, surfacing and sinking, aware of the movement of the camp around it in fragments. There are stretches of shaking cold, and then stretches of sweating as the fever breaks and climbs again, the shirtless heat of it giving way suddenly to soaked cold, and the cycle repeats without much regard for whether it is light or dark outside. Water is brought and taken in small amounts, since small amounts are all that a jaw held nearly shut allows. Food is largely refused, and the refusal is not a decision so much as the flat absence of any appetite, which is itself a well-documented feature of infection rather than a failure of will. Time loses its edges in this state. The clock that has run through this entire account, the light and the cold and the sound of the land, keeps going outside, but inside there is little to distinguish 1 hour from the next. And around this there is a group with its own requirements, in the leanest part of the year, that has to keep gathering, keep the fire fed, keep moving when the place they are in stops yielding. A person in this condition consumes rather than produces. Water carried to them, warmth kept up around them, food set aside that someone else would have eaten. The skeletal evidence for care in the deep past is genuine, if debated in its details, and it includes individuals whose injuries or conditions would have left them dependent for long stretches, and who nonetheless survived to heal. The evidence establishes that survival happened. It does not establish what it cost the people around them, and inventing a scene of that would go past anything the ground can support. What can be said is that the arithmetic was real, that it was faced repeatedly across the whole span of human existence, and that the record contains a great many people who lived through conditions they could not have lived through alone. Today, none of this stretch exists. Antibiotics reach the bloodstream within an hour of the first dose. The collection is drained, fluids are given, and a person who arrives with a swollen face and a fever is generally walking out within a day or two with the whole thing collapsing behind them. That is a recent arrangement, and its recency is the entire subject of this account. Somewhere in the 4th or 5th day, the situation reaches a point that cannot be waited out any longer. The swelling has softened at its centre under the stretched skin, warm and clearly fluid beneath the surface. The fever has not broken. The jaw has not opened. The body has been taking in almost nothing for the better part of a week in the coldest weeks of the year, and the reserves it started with were thin. Whatever is going to happen next is not going to happen by leaving it alone, and there is a fact sitting in the middle of this that the account has not yet touched. People did not simply watch. Across the long stretch of time before anything resembling medicine existed, human beings put their hands on problems like this one and did things, and some of what they did left marks that survive in the ground and can be examined today, marks precise enough that researchers have been able to work out, with reasonable confidence, what was done and roughly how. On the 4th or 5th day, in the flat cold light of a short afternoon, the situation has narrowed to a single fact that anyone looking can see. There is fluid under the skin of that face, warm and soft at its center, and it is not going anywhere on its own. What happens at this point in the sequence is the part most easily assumed away, because the deep past is often pictured as a place where people simply endured whatever arrived. The evidence does not support that picture. Human beings worked on teeth, deliberately, with tools, a very long time before anything resembling medicine existed, and some of what they did survives in a form precise enough that researchers have been able to reconstruct the technique. The oldest and simplest intervention is the one already written into the teeth themselves. Those narrow horizontal grooves worn into the sides of back teeth, found on specimens across an enormous span of time and attributed to Neanderthals and to earlier members of the human family, indicate objects worked repeatedly into the space between teeth. On some specimens, the grooves sit in mouths that also show clear signs of long-standing gum disease and bone loss, which has led researchers to propose that at least some of this working was a response to discomfort rather than only the clearing of trapped food. A stiff stem pressed hard against an inflamed gum produces a counter sensation that briefly overrides the ache beneath it. And while nobody can say what any particular ancient person intended, the association between the grooves and diseased mouths is a real pattern in the material and is treated as meaningful by the people who study it. Beyond that, the record holds interventions that are harder to explain in any other way. At a site in Italy, a front tooth several thousand years older than farming carries a large cavity whose interior surface shows fine parallel striations under magnification, marks that researchers have interpreted as the traces of a small stone point used to scrape and widen the cavity from within. Inside the cavity, traces of bitumen were found, a natural tar, along with plant fibers and hair. The interpretation offered is a deliberate cleaning of decayed material from inside a tooth, followed by the packing of the hollow with a sticky substance. From a considerably later period, teeth recovered from a site in what is now Pakistan carry small round holes drilled into the chewing surfaces of back teeth. The walls of the holes marked with concentric striations consistent with a rotating point, most likely a stone-tip drill of the kind already used for boring beads. Several of the drilled teeth show wear over the drilled surfaces, indicating the individuals went on chewing with them for a considerable time afterward. From another site, a jaw carries a tooth with a crack sealed over with beeswax, applied at or near the time of death. These finds are scattered, separated by great distances and thousands of years, and no one presents them as evidence of a continuous tradition. Each is interpreted cautiously, and the reasoning behind each has been argued over. Taken together, they establish a modest and important point. Hands went to teeth, with tools, with intent, over and over across the long stretch of human existence, and the impulse to do something about a failing tooth is at least as old as the failing teeth themselves. What the moment described here calls for, though, is something more direct than any of that, and it is a thing the ground does not preserve at all, because soft tissue leaves no record, and a cut made in a gum heals or does not heal without marking bone. A collection of fluid under pressure needs an opening. That principle requires no theory of infection to arrive at, and it is discoverable by anyone who has watched a swelling that was opened and one that was not. A sharp flake of stone, of the kind produced routinely and in enormous numbers throughout this period, and sharp enough at its edge to part skin with little force, would serve. The relief on release is immediate and dramatic, the pressure that has been building for days gone within seconds, and it would have been an unmistakable result requiring no interpretation whatsoever to recognize as good. Whether this was commonly done cannot be established, and any confident claim about how often it happened would go beyond the evidence entirely. The tools existed, the observation was available. Beyond opening, there is the tooth itself, and here the evidence is unhelpful in an interesting way. Removing a tooth deliberately is difficult in ways that are not obvious. The roots of a lower back tooth run deep and often diverge, gripped along their whole length by the fibers of the ligament, and a tooth that has been dead for weeks tends toward brittleness, so that force applied to it is as likely to break the crown away as to lift the root. What remains behind is worse than what was there before, a fragment in a socket that cannot be gripped. Ancient jaws are commonly found with teeth missing, and the sockets partly or fully closed over with remodeled bone, which establishes that teeth were lost well before death, though loss through decay and fracture cannot generally be distinguished from deliberate removal by looking at the bone alone. What that means is that the record shows a great many teeth gone and cannot say how many of them were pulled. Alongside all of this sits the question of pain, and it has no good answer. Plants containing compounds with genuine effects on pain and inflammation existed everywhere, and the willow family, which contains the compound from which a common modern painkiller was derived, is widespread and was certainly available. Traces of medicinal plants have been recovered from the dental calculus of ancient individuals, including at least one specimen whose hardened tooth deposits contain material from a plant with bitter compounds and no obvious food value, alongside signs of a painful dental condition in the same mouth. This has been read as possible self-medication, and it is one of the more direct hints available, though it remains a single line of evidence and is discussed with appropriate care. The general point is safe enough. Bitter barks and leaves with real pharmacological activity grew within reach of nearly every human population, and knowledge of local plants was extensive and accumulated across generations. What none of it could do is what matters here. There was nothing that removed a person from an experience of this severity, nothing that made a jaw held open by force something other than agony, nothing that produced the kind of blank absence a modern injection produces in a few minutes. Everything available worked at the edges of the thing. So the intervention, whatever form it took, happened in a person who was awake and present for all of it, held still by others, in the cold, at the end of a week without food. And it works, in the narrow sense of working. The pressure comes out, the tight distortion of the face slackens within the hour, the skin loses its stretched shine, the terrible fullness under it goes down, and the difference between 1 hour and the next is enormous. Pain drops to a level a person can be inside of. The jaw loosens a little, enough that water goes down more easily, and water is what the body has been needing most. By evening, with the fire built up against a hard, clear night and the cold coming down the way it does when there is nothing in the sky to hold the day's warmth, the body is lying there in a condition unrecognizably better than the one it was in that morning. Today, the same relief is produced in a treatment room in about 10 minutes, under anesthetic, followed by antibiotics that go after what the drainage left behind. That second half is the half that did not exist. Opening a collection releases what has accumulated. It does nothing whatever about the source, which is still sitting in the chamber of a dead tooth that the body's circulation does not reach, still supplying bacteria into the bone through the opening at the root tip, unchanged by anything done to the swelling outside. The immediate crisis has been answered. The thing that produced the crisis has not been touched, and cannot be, and remains exactly where it has been since the pain first stopped weeks ago. Through that night and the days after it, the fever loosens its grip by degrees, the swelling continues to subside, and food begins to go in again, in small amounts, and by any measure a person could apply from the outside. The worst has passed and the situation is improving. The season turns slowly toward its coldest stretch and then, eventually, toward its end. And in the bone of that jaw, at the tip of one root, the arrangement that has been in place for months goes on holding, quiet again, waiting on the next stretch of hunger or cold or exhaustion to shift the balance the way the last one did. The coldest stretch of the year passes, and then the ground begins to change. Water runs where it did not run a month ago, the frost holds only in the deepest shade, and the first green comes up through the flattened dead grass in the low, wet places. The body has come through the winter. It is thinner than it was, and it tires sooner than it used to, but it walks and carries and works, and the face on that side has returned to something close to its ordinary shape, the jawline findable again beneath the skin. What remains is a small firm swelling on the gum, low down, near the root of the tooth that failed, and it has been there since the fever broke. It does not hurt. Pressed with a fingertip, it yields slightly and releases a small amount of fluid with a taste in it, and then it fills again over the following days and is pressed again, and this has become a thing the body does without much thought, the way one attends to any small recurring nuisance. What has formed there is a channel, and it is the body's own solution to a problem it cannot otherwise solve. Unable to reach the source inside the dead tooth, and unable to absorb what keeps arriving from it, the tissue has instead built a permanent route to the outside, a narrow tract running from the pocket at the root tip, through the bone, through the gum, opening as that small dome. Everything the pocket produces travels out along it continuously. The pressure that drove the crisis in midwinter can no longer build, because it now has somewhere to go at all times, and so the infection settles into a state that can persist for years without ever producing another episode like that one. Clinicians see this arrangement regularly and recognize it as a chronic condition rather than a resolved one, since the underlying situation is unchanged and only the pressure has been relieved. It is a truce, and the terms are that the body stops fighting for control and simply manages the leak. The tooth over these months is coming apart. Dead teeth grow brittle, the material inside them no longer maintained, and this one has been carrying its share of chewing force through a jaw that has quietly resumed using that side, because the pain that once forbade it is gone. A piece of the crown breaks away first, taking a wall of the tooth with it, leaving a shell and a sharp edge that the tongue explores and that catches the inside of the cheek. Some weeks later, another piece goes. Food packs into the hollow that remains and cannot be got out, and the tissue around it responds accordingly. Over a longer stretch, the crown is reduced to fragments sitting at the level of the gum, and eventually the fragments loosen in a socket whose bone has been dissolving around them since the previous autumn, and one comes away in the mouth during a meal, and later another, until the position where a tooth stood for 30 years holds nothing at all. The socket does not stay open. Bone responds to the vacancy by filling it in, slowly, laying down new material until the ridge closes over and smooths, and the gum heals across the top, and within some months there is a gap in the row of teeth with solid bone beneath it. This is precisely the pattern that ancient jaws show in enormous numbers. A missing tooth, a socket partly or wholly remodeled, the bone around it smoothed and continuous, evidence that the loss happened well before death, and that the body carried on afterward. With the source finally gone from the mouth, the channel in the gum has nothing left to drain, and it closes and heals over, leaving a small firm scar, and inside the bone, a healed hollow where the pocket used to be. The illness has ended. It has taken most of a year, and it has ended the only way it could have ended, by the failing part being lost. There is a real cost left behind, and it does not announce itself for a while. A tooth in a row is braced by its neighbours on either side, and by the tooth it meets above, and removing one alters the mechanics for all of them. The teeth beside the gap drift slowly toward it over months and years, tilting rather than sliding, opening small spaces at their own contact points where food now collects in a way it did not before. The tooth in the opposite jaw, meeting nothing where it once met something, gradually moves down into the space, which changes how the two rows fit together across the whole side. Chewing efficiency drops measurably with the loss of a molar, and the remaining teeth take up the work, wearing faster under it. What that means in practical terms is that the mouth is now slightly worse at the one job it exists to do, at the beginning of the next winter, and it will be asked to do that job every day for as long as the body lives. It also means that the conditions which produced this failure have not improved anywhere in that mouth. The same grit is in the food. The same film hardens on the same surfaces with nothing to remove it. The teeth beside the gap now trap material in their new spaces. Whatever combination of wear, crack, and bacterial work opened the first door is still operating on every other tooth in the row, and the sequence that has just concluded is available to begin again from a first faint evening pressure in any of them. That is the shape of the thing that ancient jaws record so plainly. Not one catastrophe, but a series. Several sockets closed at different stages of remodeling in the same jaw. Several bone lesions at different ages, A mouth that went through some version of this repeatedly across a life and kept going. Honesty requires saying plainly that this is one ending and not the only one. The account has followed a course that resolved, because a course that resolved is what the archaeological record is best able to show, and because it was the common outcome. Other courses existed. The pocket that found its way outward through the gum might instead have found its way into the tissue spaces of the neck. The fever in midwinter might not have broken. A body already depleted at the start of a lean season had less margin than the same body would have had in a good year, and the difference between recovering and not recovering could sit in something as arbitrary as which week of the year the swelling arrived. Those endings leave almost nothing behind in bone, because they happened faster than bone can respond, which is why the record is weighted towards survival and why the true proportions cannot be recovered. What the evidence does establish is the sequence itself and how ordinary it was, and that a great many people lived through it more than once. Today, the entire arc collapses into a single afternoon at almost any point along it. Caught at the first sensitivity, a small sealed surface ends it. Caught at the throbbing, the chamber is cleaned and the tooth kept and used for another 40 years. Caught at the swelling, drainage and antibiotics finish it in a week. Even at the very end, when the tooth is beyond saving, extraction is a procedure of minutes under anesthetic, and the gap can be filled with something anchored into the bone that chews nearly as well as what was lost. There is no stage of this account that a modern person would be expected to travel further than a day into. The season keeps moving, the grass comes up properly, the days lengthen, food grows easier to find, and the body puts back some of the weight it lost through the cold months. Eating is different than it was a year ago, done more on one side than the other, slower with the tougher things, but it is eating, and it works. The tongue still goes to the gap out of a habit formed over months, finding smooth, healed ridge where there used to be a tooth, and finding it unremarkable now. Somewhere else in that same mouth, on a molar that has been grinding away at gritty food for 3 decades alongside the one that failed, the enamel has been thinning in the ordinary manner, and beneath it the microscopic tubes of the dentin are drawing closer to the open air with each passing season. Nothing about it is noticeable. Nothing about it will be noticeable for a long while yet, and then, on some evening indistinguishable from any other, it will be. A few years on, in the ordinary middle of a warm season, that mouth is a different place than it was. The gap where the first molar was lost has long since become unremarkable, the ridge smooth, the neighbouring teeth leaning gently into the space, in the way teeth do when the bracing beside them goes. There is a second gap now on the other side, from a tooth that failed in a shorter and less dramatic sequence, and a third position where only a worn root remains at gum level, dark and hard and painless, doing nothing but occupying its socket. The remaining back teeth are ground much flatter than they were, the soft inner material showing through in wide islands on the surfaces that take the most work, and one of them carries a crack running down from the chewing surface that has been there for a season and has not yet done anything. The front teeth are worn at their edges and chipped in 2 places, and a groove has been worn into the side of one back tooth by something used against it, over and over, for a long time. This is not a ruined mouth. This is a working mouth of a person who has lived a few decades in a world with nothing made for cleaning teeth, and it is close to what the archaeological record shows over and over. What such a mouth does is adapt. Chewing distributes itself across whatever surfaces still function, which means the flattest and hardest working teeth carry more than they were built to carry and wear faster because of it. Food is prepared differently before it arrives, and this is the quiet, cumulative change that matters most. Cooking taken further than it needs to go, roots left in the coals until they collapse under a thumb, meat pounded between stones until the fibres separate, tough material cut small with a stone flake rather than torn with the front teeth. Every one of those steps costs time and fuel, and every one is a small ongoing tax paid by a person and by the group around them, and none of it appears in the archaeological record as anything other than ordinary food processing. There is a nutritional dimension underneath it that is easy to pass over. Chewing is the first stage of digestion, not merely a means of making pieces small enough to swallow, and the efficiency with which the body extracts energy from food depends partly on how thoroughly it was broken down before it went down. A mouth with fewer functional grinding surfaces extracts somewhat less from the same meal, and while the difference is modest in any one instance, it runs continuously for years in a person who has no surplus to draw on. Researchers examining ancient remains have documented individuals who lost most or all of their teeth and nonetheless survived for a considerable time afterward, evident from the extensive remodeling of the empty sockets, and those cases are discussed carefully because such a person could not have processed food unaided in the ordinary way. What they establish is that survival in that state happened. The mechanism by which it happened almost certainly involved food prepared by other hands, and the inference is a reasonable one, though it remains an inference. Age enters here in a way worth stating clearly, because it is easily misunderstood. Human lifespans in the deep past were not short in the sense of bodies wearing out at 30. The averages that get quoted are dragged down heavily by deaths in infancy and early childhood, and a person who survived those years had a reasonable prospect of reaching what would now be called late middle age or beyond. What was different is that a body reaching those years had accumulated far more wear than a modern body of the same age, in the teeth as much as anywhere. A mouth of 60 in that world had been grinding gritty food for 5 decades with no way to renew a single surface, which is why heavily worn dentitions in older ancient individuals are the rule rather than the exception. The mouth aged faster than the person did, and through all of it the working at teeth continues. The stiff stems and splinters that wore those grooves, the frayed twig ends, the fingernail scraped along a hardened surface, the mouthful of water swirled and spat. All of it goes on, daily, across decades, in the face of everything described in this account. It is worth pausing on what that means. These efforts could not prevent what happened to the tooth this account followed, and could not have stopped it at any stage once it began. They were, in the terms this story has been working in, largely unequal to the problem. And people did them anyway, persistently enough to leave physical marks on their own teeth that survive thousands of years for researchers to measure. Something in a human being does not simply accept a mouth that feels wrong. The impulse to clean, to pick, to relieve, to intervene is old, and it ran continuously, long before any of it could accomplish much. What arrived eventually was not that impulse, but the equipment to make it effective. Bristles set into a handle, first in China perhaps 5 centuries ago and reaching Europe considerably later, mass production of them only in the last century or two, an understanding that the film on a tooth is bacterial, and that a mouth can be maintained rather than merely repaired, a profession dedicated to it. Fluoride, added widely to water supplies only within living memory, which reduced the rate of decay across whole populations by a margin large enough to show clearly in the numbers. Anesthetic, so that work on a tooth is something a person is not present for. Antibiotics, which turn the arc trace through this entire account into something that ends in a week. All of that is very recent. Nearly all of the human beings who have ever lived, across nearly all of the time humans have existed, kept the mouth they were born with in exactly the condition their food and their years produced, working at it with whatever came to hand, and losing the argument tooth by tooth. That mouth, a few years on, goes on doing its work through an ordinary warm evening, the light lengthening across the ground, the fire being built for the night, food coming off the coals and being eaten slowly on the side that still works well. Everything about the evening is unremarkable. And in the crack running down through one of the remaining molars, opened slightly by a lifetime of grinding and by the food that went across it today, the same slow process is underway that has been underway in this account from its first page, in a place too small to see, at a pace too gradual to feel, some months or years short of the evening when it will make itself known. Step back from that fire, and from that one evening, and let the view widen, until the individual mouth this account has followed becomes one among a very large number. The sequence traced here, from a first faint pressure through months of accommodation into a winter crisis, and out the other side into a healed gap in a jaw, ran in that mouth once, and then began again in another tooth in the same mouth. It ran in the mouths of the people sitting around that same fire, at their own pace, on their own schedule. It ran in every group, across every landscape humans occupied, in the cold north and in the tropics, among people who ate mostly meat and people who ate mostly plants. In the deep past and in the recent past, generation after generation without interruption, the material record carries it plainly. Worn crowns ground toward flat, receded gums, hardened deposits still clinging to teeth after thousands of years in the ground, small rounded openings in jawbones where infections broke through, sockets closed over with remodeled bone where teeth were lost long before death. These are not the exceptional finds that make their way into the accounts people remember. They are the ordinary background condition of human remains, so common that researchers record them as routine categories, present in an enormous share of the adults recovered from sites of nearly every period. Set against the whole span of human existence, the arrangement that most people now live inside is astonishingly thin. Bristles set into a handle appear in China perhaps 5 centuries ago and reach Europe considerably later, remaining an object for the wealthy for a long stretch after that, with mass manufacture only in the last century or so. The understanding that the soft film on a tooth is a living bacterial layer and that removing it regularly changes what happens to the tooth beneath is more recent still. Fluoride in water supplies belongs to living memory. Local anesthetic, which is what makes it possible for a person to be worked on rather than held down, arrived in the same recent window. Antibiotics, which end in a week the crisis that took most of a winter in this account, came into general use within the lifetimes of people still alive. Set every one of those against a species that has been recognizably itself for something in the order of 200,000 or 300,000 years, and against a lineage making stone tools for far longer, and the arithmetic of the title comes out plainly and probably understates itself. It is not merely that most of human history lacked a toothbrush. It is that a human being, alive today, running a brush over their teeth at the end of an ordinary day, is doing something almost no one who ever lived has done. 2 things are worth carrying away from that, and they pull in different directions, which is why both are worth stating. The first is that the ordinary evening routine everyone finds tedious is not a matter of hygiene in the sense of tidiness. It is an interruption placed at the earliest point in a sequence. This account spent 14 stages following, and the reason it feels like it accomplishes nothing is precisely that it works. Nothing happens. No first evening pressure, no month of throbbing, no winter of it. The absence of an experience is a difficult thing to feel grateful for, since there is nothing there to notice, and the entire benefit of the arrangement takes the form of things that did not occur. The second is more interesting, and it complicates any story where the past is simply worse. Those mouths were not uniformly rotten. The deep pits of decay that dominate modern dental trouble appear less often in the era before settled farming than they became afterward, and the dominant damage was wear rather than rot, driven by grit in food rather than by anything sweet. What sits at the center of this account is a mouth failing under a different set of pressures than the ones a modern mouth faces, which means the comparison is not a simple line running from bad to good. It is a trade. Different food, different damage, different sequence, and until very recently no way to interrupt any of it once it began. There is a further thing the evidence supports, and it may be the most durable part of all this. People worked at their teeth. They worked at them with stems and splinters and fibers persistently enough, over enough years, to wear grooves into their own enamel that survive for tens of thousands of years and can be measured today. They scraped hardened deposits from tooth surfaces. They chewed substances with real pharmacological activity and left traces of them in the calculus that hardened on their teeth. At scattered sites across a wide span of time and distance, they scraped out decayed material from inside a cavity and packed it with tar, drilled into the chewing surfaces of back teeth with stone-tipped points, sealed a crack with beeswax. None of it could stop what this account described. The problem lived in a place none of those methods could reach, and every one of those people would have watched the sequence run its course in others and known roughly what was coming. They did it anyway. What separates a modern mouth from that one is not that anyone began caring about their teeth recently. Caring about them is old, older than farming, older than any writing, present in the jaws of people who were not quite us. What is new is only that the caring finally has tools proportional to the problem, and there is a question at the end of this that the evidence cannot close, and that the account has been circling from its first evening without ever quite putting into words. Everything traced here happened to bodies that could not see inside themselves. The tooth gave a signal that arrived late, months after the actual damage began, and then a signal that pointed at the wrong place. And then, at the worst possible moment, no signal at all, when the pain lifted and the infection went on. A body was walking around perfectly well while bone dissolved quietly in its jaw. The pain that mattered most and the pain that felt worst were not the same events, and nothing in the experience of being inside that body distinguished them. That gap between what is happening in a body and what a body is able to report about itself did not close when brushes and antibiotics arrived. The tools improved. The reporting did not. Which raises something worth sitting with as the fire burns down. Nearly everyone who has ever lived carried a slow failure in their mouth for months or years while feeling, most of the time, entirely fine, and had no way whatever to know it. The difference now is not that bodies became more honest. It is that a few of those silences can be looked into from the outside, by light and by images made through bone, and interrupted before they finish. Only a few of them. The body is still mostly a sealed room, reporting selectively on its own contents, still capable of going quiet exactly when something has moved past the point where quiet means safe, and the number of processes a person is carrying at this moment without any sensation attached to them is not knowable from the inside. That is not a thought to be frightened by, and fear was never the useful response to any of it. The people in this account could not act on what they could not detect, and neither, in most respects, can anyone now. What can be acted on is the small set of things that do announce themselves early and quietly. The faint pressure on an ordinary evening, the twinge that lasts 3 seconds longer than it used to, all the minor signals that are easy to set down and forget because nothing about them feels urgent yet. Nearly the whole of human history had no way to answer those signals at all. Answering them is a very recent privilege, available now, mostly cheap, and mostly ignored until it stops being either. So the fire goes down to its coals, and the cold comes up out of the ground the way it always has, and the bodies lying around it settle in for a night that will pass much like the ones before it. In one of those mouths, in a crack too small to see, on an evening indistinguishable from any other, something has already begun. It will be months before anyone knows. That was the ordinary condition of being human for almost the entire time there have been humans, and it ended so recently that the ending is barely older than the oldest person alive. What else, right now, is running quietly in a body that has not yet found a way to say so?